welcome Dr. Phyllis Zagano, Senior Research Associate in Residence and Adjunct Professor of Religion at Hofstra. She's a former Fulbright Fellow to the Republic of Ireland. She was awarded the 2002 Book Award from the College Theology Society for her book, Holy Saturday, An Argument for the Restoration of the Female Diaconate in the Catholic Church. Dr. Zagano is the author of hundreds of articles and reviews in popular and scholarly journals in the United States and abroad. She writes on a variety of religious topics and is the author of Called to Serve, A Spirituality for Deacons, Women in Catholicism, Gender, Communion, and Authority, and most recently, Women in Ministry, Emerging Questions About the Diaconate. During the fall 2005 semester, Phyllis was a visiting professor at Yale Divinity School, where she lectured on Roman Catholic Ecclesiology. She holds a BA from Marymount College, 3 master's degrees, 1 in communication, 1 in literature, and 1 in theology, and a Ph.D. from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. We are honored by her presence with us this evening. And tonight, we thought we'd do something different. After the presentation, I'll invite you to have a short conversation at your table, just 2 or 3 minutes, brainstorm. What did you hear? What was challenging? What was inspiring? And perhaps form a question from your table, in addition to the individual question you might want to ask. Your questions or comments can be written on the index cards at your table, and they'll be collected, and our question period will be coordinated by Griffin Olenek. Tonight's lecture is entitled Women in Ministry, Which Way to the Future? Dr. Phyllis Zagano.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Father Bob, and thanks to Jamie and all the staff here at this beautiful and powerful symbol of the vitality of the Catholic community here at Yale. It's good to be back in New Haven. When I taught at the Yale Divinity School now almost 8 years ago, my course, as you've heard, is Roman Catholic Ecclesiology. The essential question of the course was, how is church church? Well, my friends, this is how church is church. And it's so good to see so many of you here at the tables. As you well know, not everyone finds space at the Catholic table. In my work and in my research, my writing, my speaking, I try to find space at the table for the women among us who want to teach and preach and minister within the system, as it were. I try to find room there at the table for the women with Master of Divinity degrees who are formed and trained as Catholic ministers, who are formed and trained to baptize and to witness marriages, who are formed and trained to anoint the sick and the dying, and who are formed and trained to bury the dead. But I don't do priesthood. The discussion about women as Catholic priests is not mine. My work, now for nearly 30 years, has been on the diaconal ministry of service in the Catholic churches, and specifically on the ways in which women have been and can again be included in that ministry, included directly within the diocesan clerical structure. That is, my work is on restoring women to the ordained diaconate. So I've been reading a little Italian lately. I think a lot of people may have missed the fact that Pope Francis directly called for women to have a more incisive presence in the church in his late summer interview, published in 16 Jesuit journals worldwide. Unfortunately for the English-speaking world, America Magazine dropped 2 sentences from the section on women in which the Pope's attitudes are indirectly and directly stated. But before we get to that, let's take a look at what Francis said in July of this year on the airplane ride back from World Youth Day in Rio de Janeiro. You'll remember the Pope stood for 80 minutes chatting in Italian with the journalists there on Shepherd One. The news reports were all over his "who am I to judge" remark about, in his words, gay persons. Those news reports did not focus on his comments about women in the church. Most importantly, to me at least, no news account focused on the actual question he was asked that elicited his positive remarks on women in church structure and ministry. The question came in Italian from Jean-Marie Guénois, the religion editor of the French language daily Le Figaro, and also on behalf of a colleague from the French Catholic newspaper Le Croix. Guénois said to the Pope, "You said that a church without women loses its fruitfulness." Then Guénois asked about women deacons and about women holding major portions of the church bureaucracy. "What concrete measures will you take?" Guénois asked. "For instance, a feminine diaconate or a woman as the head of a dicastery?" Francis was direct. The Pope answered, quote, "The role of women in the church must not only end as mom, worker, limited. No, it is something else. I think we need to move further ahead in the development of this role and charism of women." Then Francis continued, "I think that we haven't yet come up with a deep theology of the woman in the church. She can only do this, only do that. Now she is an altar server. Now she reads the readings. She is president of Caritas. But there is more. We need to make a profound theology of the woman. This is what I think." To me, that's a yes to women in the diaconate. Then in August of this year, Pope Francis sat down for conversations with Antonio Spadaro, the Jesuit editor of the venerable journal La Civiltà Cattolica, which has been published by the Society of Jesus in Italy since 1850. The journal has a circulation of only 15,000 subscribers. Each issue of the journal is directly reviewed by the Vatican Secretariat of State and appears with the Secretariat's approval. It is the unofficial voice of the Holy See. In a long article, the result of 3 individual meetings with the Pope, Spadaro presents Francis's own words on all manner of church questions. Questions about belonging and not belonging, questions about authority and about ministry, questions about prayer, questions about being a Jesuit. The questions I was interested in were about women in the church. The interview was published in 16 journals of the Society of Jesus, in Britain, in Germany, in Chile, in France, in Slovakia, in Italy, in the United States of America, in Portugal, in Switzerland, Greece, Spain, in Venezuela, Sweden, Belgium, Hungary, Croatia. The translation from Italian to English was managed by America Magazine, the Jesuit weekly produced in New York. The complete English translation runs approximately 12,000 words. For whatever reasons, they say it was space or a production error, America's editors cut about 1,500 words, 12.5%, from the authorized text. Let me remind you, this was at least a semi-official text. There was but one section wholly on women, yet from within the single 306-word section on women in the church, on the place of women in ministry, America's editors cut 57 words. Not that much, you say? Well, yes, maybe. But the words America's editors removed have real meaning. They color the entire section. Without these words, the Pope is saying something different. Without these words, the Pope does not sound like the Pope Francis, who has caught the world's eye and who promises new things. Without them, the Pope sounds like a bit of a chauvinist. What did Francis and Spadaro say? What does it really matter anyway? Well, to begin with, Spadaro asked only one question about women. He and Francis spent only 2.5% of their time talking about possibilities for half the church. And then America cut that down to the point that only 2% of the interview's direct quotes and commentary focus on women in the church. Now, I know that's not exactly correct. There are comments in other sections about women, and I do not accuse Pope Francis of spending 98% of his time thinking only about men and their contributions to the church, to its governance and ministry. But if you step back and take a good hard look at things, it certainly does seem like even good Pope Francis is focused, first of all, on men. How can he not be? For example, I'll use the number metaphorically rather than really. Can we agree that 98% of the liturgical ministers at any given papal mass are male. From my perspective, and I will agree wholeheartedly with the Jesuits' founder, Ignatius of Loyola here, deeds are more important than words. But deeds begin with words. And despite the fact that there were few words about women and ministry in the Spadero article, and really none in Francis's more recent conversation with La Repubblica editor Eugenio Scalfari, I think there's reason for hope. At the end of this most recent article, Francis is reported to promise another interview in which he will speak about the role of women in the church. But back to America. Once America's Jesuit editor, Matt Malone, had the omission pointed out to him, and I will tell you that when National Catholic Reporter editor Dennis Code called to ask Malone about it, Malone at first denied any edits, and only later called back to say, yes, he did cut that sentence. Once Malone had the omission pointed out to him, he posted the missing words online with a footnote and promised an advisory in the next issue of the print magazine. Later, on September 30th of this year, the entire America translation appeared on the America website. So much for production errors. Let's talk about epistemology. How do we know what we know about what the Pope says, and therefore how does what we know color what we think about what the Pope can or might do? That's all I'll say about the problem. Just listen to the salient point of the section on women as America edited it. Spadero writes, and what about the role of women in the church? The Pope has made reference to this issue on several occasions. He took up this question again during his return trip from Rio de Janeiro, asserting that a profound theology of women has not yet been elaborated. So I ask, what should the role of women in the church? What should be the role of women in the church? What can be done to make their role more visible today? Francis answers, I am wary of a solution that can be reduced to a kind of female machismo, because a woman has a different makeup than a man. But what I hear about the role of women is often inspired by an ideology of machismo. Now to me, here Francis sounds like a young cassocked cleric who wants to turn the altars around. Put back those altar rails and keep those interfering women at more than arm's length. Now listen to the commentary and response with the missing sentences. My point is a little stronger if I use my own literal translation here. Spadero writes, and what about the role of women in the church? The Pope has made reference to this issue on several occasions. In an interview, he had affirmed that the feminine presence of the church had not fully emerged because the temptation of machismo has not left space to make visible the role women are entitled to within the community. He took up this question again during his return trip from Rio de Janeiro, asserting that a profound theology of women has not yet been elaborated. So I ask, what should be the role of women in the church? What can be done to make their role more visible today? Francis answered, it is necessary to widen the space for a more incisive feminine presence in the church. I'm wary of a solution that can be reduced to sort of female machismo, because a woman has a different makeup than a man, but what I hear about the role of women is often inspired by an ideology of machismo. Now, we could be here all night parsing words and contexts, and given that one of America's translators is here, we may well be doing that soon. But for the sake of the simple question about the role of women in the church, let's just focus on what Francis said, on what was cut from the America translation. There's an Italian expression, non c'è spazio qui. There's no space. There's no room here. Francis turns that on its head. He said directly, the space must be widened, more room must be made. Francis said the church has to open up so we can see the role women are entitled to within the community, within the church. What to me is fascinating is that is exactly what Benedict XVI said when a priest of Rome asked about women in the church in 2006. And spazio is precisely the same word Benedict used. Benedict said that March day in 2006, quote, however, it is proper to ask whether in ministerial service, can we not offer more space, more positions of responsibility to women? So there are two questions here. One about ministry, and the other, I believe, about governance. So beginning with the second, can we not offer more positions of responsibility to women? Of course we can. Just after the Jesuit interview of Francis, the giant Spanish daily newspaper El País suggested female cardinals were in the works. That in and of itself is an interesting question. Digresses from ministry a bit, but let's think about it here, specifically as it involves governance. Why not have women cardinals? The Le Figaro religion editor essentially asked that on the Rio airplane. Can there not be a woman as a dicastery head? The Pope seemed to say yes. Well, a woman as a dicastery head would somewhat unremarkably be elevated to the cardinalate. She would be a lay cardinal, the first in a century and a half, but she would be a cardinal. Of course, there's canon law to deal with. Canon 351 says those to be promoted cardinals are men freely selected by the Roman pontiff, who are at least in the order of priesthood. But either a derogation from the law or a modification of it is all that would be necessary. And you have to believe, if any pope would do it, Francis would. In fact, there's no real reason, in one way or another, a woman cannot be elevated to cardinal, even at the next consistory. There's a marvelous story about that recounts that when he was asked about women cardinals, Pope John Paul II said he'd already asked Mother Teresa, and she said no. Which is exactly the point. For her own reasons, and I'm sure there are many, Mother Teresa apparently did not have time for the pomp and for the meetings, for the actual work of being a cardinal. She was doing ministry. She did not want to be an official advisor to the Pope. She seemed to do more advising by what she was doing anyway. We'll come back to that, because in the future of women in ministry is really what I am talking about. Cardinals have power. Currently, Pope Francis has gathered a group of 8 cardinals to advise him. The group, which met for the first time in Rome early this month, has been communicating since it was created. The group includes 1 Vatican official and cardinals from North, Central, South Americas, from Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia. At their first meeting, they worked on 3 action issues: a reform of the Roman Curia, beyond a simple rewrite of the 25-year-old Curia blueprint, Pastor Bonus. Secondly, the role and place of the Vatican Secretariat of State. And thirdly, the role of the laity. This latter discussion finds its representation in the announcement of a synod on family life, to be held 1 year from now in October 2014. Nice. But where are the women? In the photo of the group of 8, plus the Pope, every single person is male. It is, to my mind, a problem of perspective. It is, to my mind, a problem of inclusiveness. Because the 8 men were chosen by their positions. Each heads a major diocese, and 1 is a Vatican official. Each, as we know, is a cardinal. Many others are typically elevated to the cardinalate, members of the diplomatic corps, dicastery officials, and even theologians once in a while. But the largest cadres of cardinals they with the most influence. And they with the most influence are they with the largest span of governance, and they with the largest span of governance are patriarchs or archbishops. So the question is not how can a woman be an advisor to the Pope? Rather, the question becomes how do we include women in church governance? Women becoming cardinals would include them as advisors to the Pope, and that would be a good thing. But inevitably, they would be chosen for the additional staff position of cardinal because they already had staff positions, not line positions. Probably staff positions as heads of dicasteries. They would be employees, potentially very high-powered employees, but in the scheme of things, they would not obtain office, and becoming cardinals would not add any real jurisdiction to their jobs. Here things become difficult, because to have true authority and to hold the sort of jurisdiction we think of in church, specifically oversight of a diocese, but including being a pastor or even formally a chaplain, one must be at least a priest. And the church, at least as of this morning, is not phoning up women asking them to be priests or bishops. The canonical distinction comes from the notion of the headship of Christ for the church and the theological notion that the priest is ordained to serve in persona Christi Capitis Ecclesiae, in the person of Christ, the head of the church. Having said that, there are specific instances where women can have governing authority and jurisdiction in their own right. as prioresses of enclosed orders of nuns, or as abbesses of territorial abbeys. Women can also administer such authority on behalf of another, typically as vicars for religious, functioning for the diocesan bishop. But in just about every instance I can think of, where a lay person, let us not forget, all women are lay persons. In every instance I can think of where a lay person has authority and jurisdiction in the church, he or she is not within the system, that is, not within the clerical chain of command, as it were, of church jurisdiction and authority. So yes, we can have women cardinals. Theoretically, at least a lay person can be named as a cardinal. But no lay person would come upon that appointment by dint of his or her authoritative or jurisdictional role in the church. And becoming a cardinal would not bring with it any authority or jurisdiction. It would bring with it the opportunity to be cast in an advisory role to the Pope. Going back to our statistics, to even get close to representing women as well as they're represented in the Jesuit papal interview, you would need at least one in the group to be of 8, now advising the Pope to be female, and to even things up a bit to represent the whole church, you would need 4 women, balanced by 4 men. That is not going to happen. To be clear, I genuinely dislike those sorts of demographic choices. I believe you choose the best possible person for the job. But to simply look at the question of perspective, what we see is how we know. What we see is how we know what we know about what the church thinks of women. And I also think the church needs to admit to the fact and genuinely consider that women see things differently from men. It's a matter of either belonging or not belonging to the clerical caste. Now, I'm aware of the discussions about the role of the laity, and laity are important discussions about the absolutely crucial roles of laymen and women in our church. But in order to have any governing authority and jurisdiction, the individual must belong to the clerical state. So, here comes the O word. Can a woman be ordained? There are 2 answers to this question. Yes and no. As it happens, both are correct. The church has given reasons why women cannot be ordained as priests and by implication as bishops. In 1976, the Curial document Inter Seniores presented 2 main objections. First, the iconic argument, the priest must image Christ, and second, the argument from authority, Jesus chose male apostles. In 1994, a papal document, Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, restated the argument from authority, but it did not restate the iconic argument, and for a very real reason. It is supremely insulting to half the human race, as well as theologically illiterate, to state that a woman cannot image the risen Christ. The symbolism of the church's sacramental system always points to the resurrection, always points to the risen Lord. It is the Christ whom the priest represents, not the restricted human male Jesus. More importantly, for my work, each of these documents specifically leaves aside the question of restoring women to the ordained diaconate. It would seem a simple thing to do. The history of women ordained to the diaconate is well known, although argued negatively in one small corner of contemporary theological history. In the 1970s, noted liturgist Roger Grisson wrote a book analyzing for the 20th century the documented history of women who ministered in the Christian Catholic diaconate, East and West. Grisson's work was countered by Aimé Georges Marymount, who admitted the facts of history, but who said that women were never sacramentally ordained, and that a woman cannot image Christ. Marymount's use of the iconic argument has been retooled by 2 more contemporary theologians, Sarah Butler, a member of the International Theological Commission, and Gerhard Müller, the prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The real logic, as it were, is that women cannot be ordained as deacons because women cannot become priests. However, the unspoken converse is their real problem. If a woman can be ordained a deacon, then she can also be ordained a priest. But the Church has said, more or less definitively, that it does not have the authority to ordain women as priests. So to argue that ordaining a woman as a deacon automatically qualifies her for priesthood is to disagree with what many find is the definitive teaching of the Church. Again, that the Church does not have the authority to ordain women as priests. The fact of the matter is, any Catholic can receive any sacrament unless impeded by law. And it is law, the fact that the Church presently teaches and believes it does not have the authority to ordain women as priests. It is law that restricts women from priesthood. Further, to confect a sacrament, one must intend to do as the Church does. That is, one must intend to be in union and communion with the whole Church. I think right now the argument is whether or not the teaching is irreformable, whether or not it can be changed. But for our purposes, let us take the position that the teaching cannot be changed, that women cannot be ordained as priests because the Church does not have the authority to ordain women to priesthood. But then there's the diaconate. And the ordinary means of entering the clerical state is by ordination to the diaconate. And to obtain office in the Church, one must be a cleric. And let's not forget, there are 3 ranks of cardinal: cardinal bishop, cardinal priest, and cardinal deacon. But why bother? Why should any woman bother getting involved in the clerical case, especially in the rank of deacon? Deacons do little, if anything, anyway, and what they do, they mostly do for free. What difference would it make if a woman, any woman, were to be ordained a deacon? Well, why not? There are 153 fishes in the Sea of Peter. Why not an ordained woman among them? There are many reasons, internal and external to the Church, why women should, and I would say must, be restored to their rightful places in the order of deacon. The internal reasons are natural and to mind obvious. The role of the deacon is to minister and live the word, the liturgy, and charity. The word. It is the deacon who is charged with the gospel, to live it as above, and to carry it to the people. It is the deacon who studies the word and who prays the word and who preaches the word of God. And charity. It is the deacon who in the early church received the congregants' gifts at the church door. Some gifts were brought to the altar at the offertory and became Eucharistic food and drink. Some gifts were given to the needy. Finally, the deacons paid the priests. I think women are sometimes more inclined to find aid for the poor. Remember Mother Teresa, or even Dorothy Day. And think of the hundreds of thousands of women religious. There are 400,000 in the world today. The hundreds of thousands of women religious who minister to the ill, to the destitute, the uneducated, the dying, and whose ministries are, for the most part, self-incorporated and self-funded. And the liturgy. In the liturgy, it is the deacon who symbolically and really is the go-between the priest and the people. Just as in ancient times, the ordained woman deacon handled matters concerning women on behalf of the bishop, so today, symbolically and really, it is the deacon who speaks directly to the people in the Mass. It is the deacon who preaches, and rightly so, because it is the deacon who, theoretically at least, is most directly connected to the Word and to the Church's charity. And what else is there to preach about? What else should one preach about? The internal reasons for ordaining women as deacons move beyond the actual functions of the deacon, because these functions, while common to every deacon, are what support other services he, and we hope she, can render to the people of God through the Church as an organization. I've used the expression to obtain office here this evening. Only a cleric can formally obtain office in the Church. While there are some offices deacons cannot obtain, there are a few they can, and a few others to which they would more easily be appointed. Parish administrator comes to mind, simply because they're clerics. The Church is bound, some say bound up, by canon law. And the canons restrict laity from sharing governance and authority within any clerical structure. But the deacon can, in addition to performing the ministries of the word, the liturgy, and charity, minister through governance and authority and be delegated to so minister. The typical example is the woman chancellor of a diocese, who cannot sign many documents because she is not a cleric. Or the woman judge on a diocesan or metropolitan tribunal who may write a single judgment but cannot render it, cannot sign it. Legalities aside, there's the external witness the ordained woman would bring to the world. The Cleveland priest Donald Cousins included this question in his latest book, Notes from the Underground, the spiritual journal of a secular priest. Cousins asks us to imagine a pontifical mass in St. Peter's Basilica where half the servers are female and the deacon proclaiming the gospel is female. Yes, imagine that. And imagine what it would say to the female victims of human trafficking, or dowry burnings, or of FGM, of rape, of incest, of every sort of indignity and crime committed against women and girls in every corner of the planet. If half the church was represented symbolically underneath those Bernini pillars, right up there at the throne of Peter, what would that say to those who suffer? What would that say to those who perpetrate these violences, large and small? What even would it say to those whose snide remarks and wolf whistles plague the days of hundreds of thousands of women and girls? Imagine for a moment the ordained woman vested as deacon at that papal mass. What would it say to those inside and outside the church? What would it say? What it would say is, by ordaining a woman to the diaconate, the church proclaims, really as well as symbolically, that women can and do participate in the resurrection, that women can and do represent Christ. It's not only possible, it's critical. It's critical for the life of the church and for the life of the world. The way to the future for women in ministry is through the ordained diaconate. I am convinced of it. And let's not forget that on the plane ride back from Rio, Francis gave a fairly unqualified yes to women as deacons. I hope so. I really do. I hope for our sake. I hope for the sake of our church. I hope for the sake of our world. Thank you.
Well, that will generate some conversation, for sure. Just take 2 or 3 minutes. What'd you hear? What did you agree with? What challenged you? And either come up with a question at your table or an individual question you want to ask yourself. 3 minutes. Go to work. I get to ask the first question while they're being collected. And my question would be this. In the Acts of the Apostles, when the church decides to have deacons, it's because the presbyters are neglecting the word and being more involved with the distribution of bread. And so the presbyters can be focused on the word. Deacons were ordained to help with the distribution of bread. How did it come about that deacons then became preachers of the word?
In 25 words or less. Because the easy answer is because the deacon's charge was charity. As I said, what else does one preach about? And also it's really after the 4th century, as the liturgies developed, particularly in the East, the sacred mysteries were tended to by the deacon inside the iconostasis. But coming outside the iconostasis was only the deacon. The priest stayed inside the iconostasis. So coming outside the iconostasis to speak to the people was the deacon. So that's pretty much how the preaching part, because as I said in the talk, the deacon is the one who speaks to the people directly in the Mass. And that's kind of where that comes from. I would remind you in Acts 6, 1-6, it is the apostles who call forth the deacons from the assembly. And so the argument from authority against returning women to the diaconate does not stick, because Jesus really doesn't have anything to do with it. It's an act of the church. Griffin.
Jesus wasn't So thank you. The first question is, how do you understand the possibility of a symbiotic relationship between men and women in the church? And specifically, how can lay men participate in the struggle for justice for women in the church today?
Gee, I don't know. I don't like the word symbiotic relationship. If by that you mean how can ordained men and women work together, if that's what you mean, there are plenty of stories in history of teams of ministers. The supper at Emmaus was a man and a woman. You know, the 72 who went out were probably married couples. So I think that those things can be worked out. And I actually, I was reading something, it was all sorts of exciting stuff I get to read. This was in the 5th century. And it was about a situation such as I think you're asking. And it was men and women, celibate team of men and women ministers, one man, one woman. And I called up a friend of mine, a woman religious, who worked in that capacity for 19 years with a pastor. And I talked to her about it and asked her about how that worked. And it works very well if both people are well-formed and psychosexually mature. It doesn't work if one or the other has some kind of a problem. And we don't need to talk about stained glass ceilings here. I think that these things can be worked out. I've spent a lot of time working in men's organizations, and it can be difficult. So I don't know. In terms of lay men helping, well, why not? I think to support the interests of women who wish to minister, to accept the women who minister. You still see people who change communion lines because it doesn't count unless you get it from the priest. And then next step would be it doesn't count unless you get it from a male Eucharistic minister. So I think these things, certainly in pockets of the world, there's 1.2 billion Catholics, and 1.2 billion Catholics, there's another billion Christians. I'm sure there's a couple out there who don't like the idea about ordaining women, but I'm sure there's a couple out there who do. Thanks.
The next question is, we were magnificently inspired and affirmed. Our question is, where do we start? What can we do tangibly?
Call up your bishop. There's some books outside. This book, Women Deacons, Past, Present, and Future, was launched at Loyola University in Chicago about 2 years ago. And I actually just met a campus minister from Loyola University in the hotel lobby because he went to high school with the new president of Yale. But anyway, since that time, my Australian publisher had the Australian equivalent of Future Church send copies of this book in the Australian edition to every bishop in Australia and New Zealand. Other donors have given money to send the book to every bishop in the United States, to every bishop in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. There's a plan to send to every bishop in Canada, the Philippines, and Indonesia. And so much so, I spoke once about a year and a half ago, and a family foundation man asked the lady who was my hostess, I want to meet her, and I said, I can't, I have to go to Australia. But anyway, when I came back, we had dinner, and the man said, I want to give you money for my family foundation. How do I do that? I said, well, I need $2,500 to start a research fund at Hofstra University. Up to that time, my publisher, Paulus Press, was taking in the funds because they're a nonprofit, and people could send them $25 or $3,000, whatever they wanted to send, and it all got registered properly and nobody got into trouble. So he said, okay, come see me and my wife for coffee on Saturday morning, which I did, and I went with my papers and I had my folder and I was all set to give my speech, and I opened my mouth and he said, We've decided to give you $10,000. I said, okay. And when you run out of that, let me know. So he doesn't want to use that money for books. We're using that money to help me attend academic meetings, to help me buy books of my own, and to hire a researcher whose Ph.D. I helped her with her Ph.D., which was at the Sapientia, so now I have a researcher who works for me. But if laymen want to help, and if people want to do that, I'm looking for $5,000 to send more books to bishops. But you can also just call your bishop. I called Henry Mansell before I came here. In my many years ago, I was a researcher for the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, John O'Connor, and he always said, before you open your mouth in some guy's diocese, will you please call him up and tell him you're going to be there? So I always call Henry and tell him when I'm coming. But I think bishops listen to what's heard, and he's a very nice guy, and there are many good bishops around. I can tell you that the Association of U.S. Catholic Priests last June 27th voted on a resolution in Seattle, Washington, to support the ordination of women to the diaconate, and they have a letter that they're sending to the U.S. Catholic Conference, U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, but they're also sending it to their individual bishops. I would say talk to your bishop, talk to your pastor. Book clubs in Voice of the Faithful has a movement where book clubs are taking this book and studying it. Part of the money that my funding is going to, part of the project my funding is going to be to create a MOOC. You've heard of MOOCs, Massive Online Open Courses. Well, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do a MOOC. I'm going to Massive Online Open Seminar, which will be a four-week seminar on this that we'll do at Hofstra University. We hope to have it open online for free in June. So what you can do is just get people to talk about it. Because if the church needs women as deacons, the church will have women as deacons. I know what I'm getting, the kind of information I'm getting. I have been told by more than one person to leave my cell phone on. The kind of response I'm getting has certainly been ratcheted up since the summer. But the conversation has to continue. And it may be that your bishop, it may be that Henry Mansell decides he doesn't need women as deacons in this diocese, but it may be the guy in the next diocese does. The point is to have women ordained as deacons. And show this to the world. To me, that's the most important part, very much the most important part. To the symbolic nature of our sacramental system is crying for this, When Pope John Paul II came to Central Park, I was the closest woman to him in the whole event. And I was the closest woman to him in the whole event because as a researcher for the Archbishop, I got the PR guy to put me on the camera podium. So for literally 100 yards behind me and 100 yards ahead of me, it was all men. It looked ridiculous from up there. It looked ridiculous. It looked ridiculous. And how that must look to the world. I'm sorry, Griffin, I'm taking your time. Here, ask me a question.
No, that's fine. In that way, why do you not promote both, why do you not promote the ordination of women as both deacons and priests?
Well, I think first of all, they're two separate ministries. I really, really think the church needs more ministry. And ministry, the ministry of charity, is the ministry of the deacon. I think that priests are important, but it is the work of the lay people, it is the work of the deacon to bring the gospel, to bring the gospel to those in need, to the poor, to the sick, to the dying. That's part of it. The other part of it is I don't know. I have no. I just don't see it at this point. I think that the priest, when we look at the priest, it's not the icon of Christ's problem, it's the icon of what we've made of the priest. So I just don't think that if I walk down the center aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral waving this is my Yale ID card, but waving my I'm a priest card, my celebrate, I think I'd be stoned. I just don't think our church is ready for that. But anyway, I for whatever reason, the diaconate is my interest and has always been, not as a political issue, but rather as a way to expand the church's ministry.
That's an excellent segue into the next question, which is, how and when did you become inspired to pursue this topic? How have you dealt with objections to your work?
Well, I'm from New York. And the other part of that is, if you don't like what I'm doing, call a cop. But I honestly, I was a graduate student at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, writing my dissertation on questions of anamnesis, on actually the way the word creates presence in literature and in sacrament. And I was working for a man named Patrick Heelan, a priest of the Society of Jesus, who was he's a great philosopher, you must know him, but he also was the vice president at Stony Brook. And I used to leave, it was before office refrigerators, so I used to leave my lunch on his office, on the ledge outside his office. And I walked past and I said, Patrick, you know, I've been praying about this word and I don't know what it means. I said, tell me what this word diaconia means. And so we talked about it. So, and that's where it came from, and that's where I followed it. And it's always been about service. It's always been about diaconia. And I cannot prove that women have been ordained as priests. I can find evidence that women celebrated Eucharist, but I cannot find evidence that women have been ordained as priests. And the historical argument seems to carry the day right now.
Thank you. The next question, the final question, again pertains to women's ordination, but this time from the perspective of the hierarchy. Do you feel that the church leadership fears that the ordination of women as deacons will invariably lead to pressure for ordination as priests? In other words, is it impossible to open the door at all?
Well, they say so. I was told in the early 90s, Cardinal O'Connor told me in the 90s that the conversations in Rome were specifically on this point. They couldn't figure out how you could ordain a woman as a priest and not, ordain a woman as a deacon and not ordain her as a priest. And I said, okay, I'm dumb, you're right, you can ordain her both as a deacon and a priest. You know. However, and he called me, and actually this book, Holy Saturday, is the first book I wrote about it, and Cardinal O'Connor helped me outline it. And I brought him the outline. I'll never forget, we were sitting in the residence, and he said, Phyllis, if you have proved that women can be ordained as deacons, you've proved that women can be ordained as priests. I said, Your Eminence, I'm not allowed to talk about that. Why are you bringing it up? Oh, he said, that's very good. Make that point 3. So I had to go back and write a new chapter, that the judgment that women cannot be ordained priests does not apply to the question of whether women can be ordained as deacons, and vice versa. That no one who's ordained a deacon is automatically qualified. And this is because of what's called the cursus honorum. In the Middle Ages, the orders were collapsed. And so anyone who was to be ordained a priest was merely ordained a deacon in course. You know, it's kind of, it just happened. Very few people stayed at the diaconal level, okay? Maybe they flunked out, whatever. And then there were the 7 ceremonial deacons in each diocese or patriarchy. But the absorption, the arrogation really, the arrogation of all of the duties of the diaconate into the priesthood really, I think, are what killed the diaconate. And I think part of the reason the diaconate got killed is because the deacons handled the money. Deacons controlled all the money. And so it got changed. If you think about it, it's really deacon to the bishop and priest to the bishop. St. Ignatius says the deacon is his right hand, and he is. When a woman needed to go and ask the bishop for a favor, needed help, needed something from the bishop, the woman went to the woman deacon, who then spoke to the bishop. When you hear that they say in history, well, the duties of the deacon were gotten rid of because we don't have baptism by immersion anymore, so we don't need women deacons. Well, that's silly. The men deacons mostly ministered to the men, and the women deacons mostly ministered to the women. And this goes on, and there's a wonderful, I'll publish this in Worship, a journal out of Liturgical Press in Collegeville, Minnesota, in Worship in January, I think, January, February. But this is a piece by Cipriano Vagaggini. It's a great Eastern liturgist. And it's an argument in 1987, an intervention he gave to the 1987 Synod on the Laity. But I just translated this the other day. It's fabulous. And let us not forget that Benedict XIV, when he approved in forma specifica, that's as a pontifical law, the Lebanese Maronite Synod of 1736 allowed deaconesses of that rite, who at the time were usually abbesses of monasteries, among other things, to give extreme unction to their nuns. Oh, hello. Deacons are not allowed today to give extreme unction because those sacraments have been collapsed. Confession and extreme unction have been collapsed. There still are rites with separate just extreme unction. But think about it. A woman or a man, a woman dying in a hospital bed, I don't want some guy coming playing with my hands. I just don't want it. I would rather be anointed by a woman. I really would. Particularly if I don't know the person. And this is the argument that St. Epiphanius gives in the 4th century for having women as deacons, because it is unseemly to send a man into the home of a sick woman. There's a wonderful verb that it means uncover, but it also means disclose. And I think it's Epiphanius, either Epiphanius or John Salamis, who says that the reason you need women as deacons is because it is unseemly for a woman to disclose herself to a man. Uncover herself certainly in baptism, but to disclose herself to a man. I think that the priesthood is obviously necessary, is vital to our church, but the way our church has developed, the way we come together in communion, we have as the priest, the icon of the priest, the icon of Christ, we have the man. But I think that for service, we need both men and women, married, married and single, religious and secular. We need everybody, we need everybody at the table. We need everybody to be able to have a place at the table, without which I think we don't have church.
You've certainly given us an awful lot to think about, and your book will continue the conversation. They're available in the courtyard. We had invited Phyllis to come for our 75th anniversary, but the Hurricane Sandy got in the way, and she was unable to be here, so we're delighted that you're able to be here tonight. Thank you very much.